I still feel that, particularly now that we have a ceasefire, of course, the ceasefire has been violated in many ways, but it is holding in a way, for instance, better than, say, Syria. I still feel that, it's important that we try to kind of maintain that ceasefire. And, the United States is providing, $300 million in security assistance. But, that is still not supplying Ukraine with an enormous amount of offensive weapons. And at the moment, the situation as a frozen conflict is, and I say this with a heavy heart, of course, but is, the best scenario we have right now. Surrender, no. Not in the sense of surrendering it as a territory that would then be absorbed by Russia, as the case seems to have been with Crimea. But I do recommend that the terms of Minsk II be adhered to. In other words, some form of election take place in the Donbas, and the folks there have an opportunity to have some form of self-determination, as well as, a degree of decentralization. Decentralization has been on the agenda in Ukraine for many years, prior even, of course, to the current conflict. So, and in any kind of scenario that would involve Ukraine becoming part of the EU 25 years from now, as some have predicted, decentralization would also be part of any kind of agreement with the European Union. So I see that as kind of necessary, but I do not in any way support those regions becoming kind of territorially seized by Russia, if you will. Again, I wasn't happy with what happened in Crimea, and I'm not happy with the situation as it is now, but it is, we could say, a small sacrifice for Ukraine to achieve a measure of political, economic, and geopolitical stability. At some point in the future, the status of Crimea might change as a result of agreements between Ukraine and Russia, as a function of how people in Crimea view their situation. But for the moment, again, Ukraine has far more important things to focus on than the status of Crimea. We have an example, of course, in Chechnya of how Russia deals with territories that were previously rebellious, and he just has given or extended the authority of Kadirov in Chechnya for another God knows how long period. One could imagine, a similar situation in the Donbas, in which a kind of Kadirov figure was given Russia's imprimatur to rule with a heavy hand, and that would be a tragedy as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that Russia responds in 100% only to force. I do believe that force, unfortunately, is weighs very heavily in Putin's calculations. There are other issues. Certainly the status of the Russian economy, Russia's position geopolitically, all of those play a role as well. But, it is clear that Russia will press its advantage if it sees an opportunity. And the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned right now for Ukraine, well, two things, of course. One is some degree of political stability in the near term, and that means forming a government that can last for longer than a couple of weeks. Number two would be getting a handle on corruption, and that is, number one economic priority. And then corollary to that is, achieving the kind of economic stability that would release the next tranche of IMF funds and start to grow the Ukrainian economy. I mean, Ukrainian economy contracted by nearly 10% in 2015. It has, the fact that the IMF is projecting a 1% increase via GDP for 2016 speaks to, what a dire economic situation it is, because, of course, that is a victory as far as the IMF is concerned, a 1% increase in economic growth. So, I mean, these are essential for Ukraine to have any kind of negotiating position, bargaining position vis-a-vis anybody, Russia, the EU, the United States, a country with political instability and basically an economy that has bottomed out is not a country that has too many cards it can play in any kind of geopolitical card game. I mean, the United States might be relinquishing, quote unquote, relinquishing Ukraine. In other words, I think what Matlock is saying is it's not fighting as hard as it could for Ukraine rather than abandoning Ukraine. But I don't think it's really an issue of the arms race. I think there are other questions in U.S.-Russian relations that take precedence, frankly, over the nuclear question. That involves the status of Eastern Europe, largely understood, the largest understanding of Eastern Europe, including what many people consider Central Europe, the Balkans, and of course parts of the former Soviet Union like Ukraine. The future of the European Union, which I think the United States is extraordinarily concerned about. If this European Union were to fall apart, that would have very dire ramifications for the global economy and for the U.S. economy in particular. Sure, nuclear weapons are an issue, and we're having the nuclear summit here in Washington, so nuclear weapons are a major topic. Obama administration very concerned about nuclear proliferation. The fact that arms control negotiations with Russia have not gone anywhere recently, those are of major concern. But compared to, say, 2009, when the Obama administration was pushing harder for reductions in nuclear arsenals, including the U.S. arsenal, I'm afraid that the issue has gone to the back burner. I know when I say I'm afraid, I mean it quite literally. I mean, I would prefer that the United States and other countries would put a little bit more emphasis on reductions in nuclear weapons. But I don't see it as the primary issue in the relationship between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia. Much more important, I think, for Russia has been the Middle East. And the fact that the United States, from Putin's point of view, effectively helped destabilize the Middle East is probably the most important kind of strategic consideration from Putin's point of view. Now, I don't think Putin believes the United States necessarily did this deliberately, but obviously Obama's reaction to the Arab Spring, his decision to eventually withdraw support for Mubarak in Egypt, and then to pursue, if only covertly, support for anti-government rebels in Syria. Now this fundamentally challenged Russia's geopolitical position globally. Cuba, far away, relatively minor. Middle East, big time. I mean, we're talking about Russia's, only real major overseas military base in Syria. The possibility of client states that Russia had counted on for decades, basically going under, and the potential of that, of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, not necessarily the rise, but the intensification Islamic fundamentalism, and it spread north and east into former Soviet Union. Now that touches directly on to Russian national interests. And so if we look at, the calculus of Putin over the last, since 2002, basically, and why it would, for instance, take advantage of opportunities, shall we say, in Ukraine, the opportunities of pro-Russian separatists who, want to align themselves more closely with Moscow. I think it's the Arab Spring, the situation in the Middle East, the potential détente with Iran between the United States and Iran. Those are the factors that I think are really driving Putin's policies. That is a tough question. I mean, it was a long time ago, and the United States is, it is. I mean, I'll give you another example. In the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush spoke of, U.S. support for a much larger kind of European architecture that would include the Soviet Union and then, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia. And it imagined that, and this is H.W. Bush's conception, that this would provide the kind of stability that was necessary in the post-Cold War world. And it was an inclusive vision, and it responded to a kind of Republican Party emphasis on geopolitical stability, and it also reflected bipartisan consensus in the United States that that here was an opportunity to kind of solidify U.S. gains coming out of the Cold War. But that didn't last very long. And it didn't last very long in part because of what happened on the ground, and the especially in Eastern Europe, the calls by the leadership in most of the countries to join NATO and join it rather quickly. It also corresponded to a move away from a more active Europe-centered security architecture, which ultimately George H.W. Bush ended up supporting. And it also was a response in part during the early years of the Clinton administration to push by lobby groups within the United States, mainly military-industrial complex lobbies, who saw an enormous opportunity in all of these new potential members of NATO to essentially buy all these weapon systems from the United States in order to come up to par, to come up to the requirements of NATO membership. I think all these factors kind of pushed the United States to abandon what had been, from my point of view, quite a good and sensible approach to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and to a much more, shall we say, Washington would call it proactive. I would say it was somewhat more aggressive approach to the security situation in the early 90s. In other words, the landscape changed rather dramatically into 1995, and the U.S. effectively changed its policy as a result. The United States has never been particularly punctilious about holding to agreements that it's signed with other countries. It's always has always effectively invoked its exceptionalist tradition and saying, those were different times, those were different situations, and we've moved on. The United States has moved on. Now, to be fair, we could also say that this is a function of American politics. I'll give you an example. In 1994, the United States also signed the agreed framework with North Korea. And the Clinton administration, I do believe, intended to follow the provisions of that agreement. But when it brought that agreement to Congress, even though it agreed, even though it basically ratified that agreement, it did so under the understanding that North Korea was going to collapse in a couple of years. Basically, the Clinton administration said, well, don't worry about this so much. North Korea is going to collapse. So when it came to subsequent kind of follow-on agreements that were basically listed in the agreed framework, Congress balked and said it wasn't going to provide the money, for instance, to pay for the construction of 2 light water nuclear reactors. Now, you could say, yes, at one level, the United States basically violated that agreement. But to call it the United States would be a misnomer, because the administration was, I think, entirely willing to adhere to the agreement, but it was Congress ultimately that said no. And we have had any number of examples of administrations that have signed agreements that Congress has basically resisted. Now, if you multiply that by the additional consideration that we have changes in administration, so a Republican administration will say, well, we don't agree with the agreement that the Democratic administration signed. Well, then you have ample opportunities for the United States to renege on agreements, even without kind of invoking some larger exceptionalist tradition that it does on occasion as well. I mean, you could say that there's been an improvement over the years. I mean, the United States, it has a long history of not abiding by agreements, but you could argue that from the 1960s, certainly from the 1970s on, the United States has had a better record of adhering to agreements, and certainly of at least participating in international negotiations. I mean, but take a look at the law of the seas. I mean, the law of the seas has been basically, I mean, it's de facto law. I mean, even though a number of countries don't adhere to it, including the United States. And any number of administrations have tried to push Congress to ratify this agreement, but it has not happened. Now, the positive side is that, A, the United States was instrumental in actually, U.S. lawyers, that is, in actually coming up with the agreement. So the United States actually did participate very heavily in the construction of this international regime, this legal regime. And number two, even though the U.S. government hasn't actually ratified the agreement, it has effectively abided by it nevertheless, even though Congress refuses to ratify it. So you could call that hypocrisy, and it would be perfectly legitimate to call it hypocrisy. On the other hand, you could see it as incremental improvement in U.S. conduct internationally. We would hope that at a certain point we would kind of reach a critical mass in which the United States, on a number of different fronts, not only was participating in the construction of international rule of law, but actually abided by international rule of law. And I think at some point that will happen. It just hasn't happened yet. Well, I mean, let's take a look at Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian regime is certainly not one that has a philosophy or a conduct that is at all congruent with U.S. ideals of democracy, human rights, etc. And yet, when Saudi Arabia attacks Yemen, the United States has provided all sorts of intelligence on the ground, not to mention billions of dollars of military assistance. I mean, it hasn't been free because obviously Saudi Arabia has money. But why does the United States do this when, first of all, Yemen is not a particularly important national security issue for the United States, and number two, Saudi Arabia is obviously a kind of reprehensible regime from the point of view of U.S. ideals. However, Saudi Arabia is an extraordinarily important ally. It's rich, It has energy. It has influence. We need it, quote unquote, on our side in a variety of contexts in the Middle East. In other words, my recommendation for Ukraine is to become a strong country. In other words, to become a politically stable and economically prosperous country, at which point the United States calculations change. It's no longer a question of, well, we want to see a democratic country emerge in the region. We want to have a good ally. No, I mean, the U.S. calculations become very, very realpolitik. Ukraine is economically vital and a political ally which is critical in the region, rather than simply a country that's asking for assistance on the doorstep of Washington. Those unfortunately are the calculations that take place here in Washington. They are not usually. I mean, I'm not saying the values and principles have no role to play in U.S. policymaking. They do, but they are effectively trumped by realpolitik considerations most of the time. Again, speaking from the point of view of the Obama administration and whatever likely administration will replace it, what they want from Ukraine is basically some form of status quo to be established in the Donbas region, which is ambiguous. Ambiguous because lack of ambiguity in that region will be unstable from the point of view of the Obama administration. Either it will be seen by Putin as incentive to continue fighting, or it will be seen conversely as an incentive by Kiev to continue fighting. If it's ambiguous, well, then a ceasefire is more likely to continue. Let's just assume that the ceasefire continues and the status of Donbas remains ambiguous. And when I say ambiguous, what I really mean is that some kind of form of elections takes place there. It remains within Ukraine, at least provisionally, but it has greater autonomy. And unfortunately, Russia maintains some kind of influence there, preferably not military influence. If that continues, Ukraine will have an opportunity to consolidate within its everything that's not Donbas, grow economically, succeed economically, and ultimately persuade the majority of people in the Donbas that it makes far more sense to throw in their lot with Kiev than with Moscow. That, I hope, would be the kind of best case scenario from the Washington inside the Beltway point of view. Is it an ideal situation? No. Is it a just situation? No. But in the world of geopolitics, there's no better revenge than success. And in this sense, I would argue that economic and political success are the most important things that Ukraine should push for right now. And that means, there's going to be a vote next week in the Netherlands on the association agreement with the EU. And unfortunately, it looks like the Dutch people are going to vote no, which is unbelievable, to be honest. But it has nothing to do with Ukraine and everything to do with the push of Eurosceptics within the Netherlands. But the association agreement with the EU is absolutely essential from my point of view, because the most important thing for Ukraine right now is to sell what it produces. And if it doesn't have these advantages accorded by the association agreement to sell the Ukrainian goods inside the EU, it's going to be extremely difficult for the Ukrainian economy to grow. So it's provisions like this, like the association agreement, that are essential for the economic and, I would argue, ultimately the political success of Ukraine. And that, as I said, I think is the best road forward, and the road that is most likely to prove persuasive in terms of the larger kind of territorial integrity of the country. Well, look, I mean, low energy prices are a great geopolitical boon for the United States, and not just with respect to Russia. But I don't think the United States has that kind of control over Riyadh, and Riyadh's not the only country involved in determining the price of oil. So, but you got to know that folks inside the Obama administration are rejoicing that the price of energy, the low price of energy at the moment, is hitting Russia hard. But as I've always said, Putin isn't the worst that Russia can offer. I mean, there are plenty of political currents inside Russia that are in some respects much worse than Putin, much more aggressive in terms of their belief in Russian expansionism, much more aggressive in terms of their actual embrace of outright fascism. And so, it's not like I think Putin is great, but, there could be worse. And extreme instability in Russia could bring some of those even more far-right trends to the foreground in Russia today. But to get back to your question, and that is a hands-off attitude, in some sense I don't think there is a hands-off attitude. I mean, I think the U.S. provision of $300 million in security assistance to Ukraine, the EU's push for association agreement, the monitoring of the ceasefire by the OSCE and other institutions. I mean, it's not hands-off. It's not aggressive in the sense of aiding Ukraine in an attempt to kind of recapture or to ensure territorial integrity for all of Ukraine. But I wouldn't call it hands-off. I do think it's sufficient attention and engagement to signal to Russia that both the United States and the EU would not tolerate a more aggressive Russian push in those regions. I do think that Russia's activity in the Middle East and in Syria in particular, its falling out with Turkey, number of other geopolitical factors make Ukraine less of a priority at the moment, and this offers us a window of opportunity. And when I say us, I mean the Ukrainian government and everybody who wants to see the Ukrainian government succeed. Many people point to Slovakia as a similar situation. Slovakia, was in a particularly bad situation after the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Economically, the industry was in the doldrums. The political situation was basically authoritarian, and there was enormous corruption in Slovakia. Its application to join the EU was delayed, but there was a window of opportunity, effectively for Slovak activists to push for the government to turn around in Slovakia, to transform it politically, to ensure that there was enough political transparency and stability to ensure a flow of resources into Slovakia. And as a result, what turned out to be what looked like the worst case scenario in all of the Visegrad countries, at least, turned around to become actually the economic growth factor in the region. Slovakia was the leading economic GDP grower in the region in the 2000s after they finally got rid of Vladimir Mečiar. The Slovak path could be of great inspiration to Ukraine. Now, there wasn't there were some kind of ethno-territorial questions, nothing as substantial as Donbas or as Crimea with Slovakia. So Slovakia did have that advantage, but I do think that does represent a potential kind of model for Ukraine, as long as the territorial question remains effectively off the agenda. When I say off the agenda, I mean we don't have outright war going on as we did for a year and a half or so. But you didn't fail to persuade me that territorial integrity is important. I believe that territorial integrity is important. It's a question of how to achieve that territorial integrity. Ultimately, I believe that the Donbas will remain part of Ukraine, and it will do so peacefully. As a function, not so much of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but as a function of a democratic political process. And you could argue that effectively territorial integrity is always what Renan said, and that is basically a referendum every day. The nation is a referendum every day on its own existence, and if there's ever any disagreement in a national referendum on the existence of the nation state, fundamentally that has to be dealt with at a political level, not at a military level. When it is dealt with at a military level, then you have, in some sense, already lost the argument. And that doesn't mean that folks in Kiev made a mistake, or the folks who support territorial integrity in the Donbas made a mistake, because I don't think they did. I do see it as not initially a Russian aggression, but an aggression that was started by militants in Donbas and then supported by Russia. But it does mean that in order to get out of this impasse, it requires a political solution. And now, you could argue that the political solution required a military response in order to get to level the playing field, if you will, or to demonstrate to Russia that it had to negotiate as an actor in negotiations. But I would argue that that's already taken place, that Ukraine has already demonstrated that it will fight for the preservation of territorial integrity, that we've already gone through that particular phase, and that at this point, with a ceasefire that is, problematic but holding in large part, that at this point it really requires politics, and behind that, economics, i.e., economic success in Ukraine. That will define Ukraine as a nation more effectively than in this day and age. I'm not, if we were talking about the 16th century or the 17th century, yeah, of course. You decide nations by force of arms, through blood and steel, as Bismarck would say. But I don't believe that we are in that era any longer. Putin might believe that he is still in that era, but effectively we have countered him and his geopolitical vision of the world and centered Ukraine back in a 21st century in which territorial integrity is decided at the polls and through politics, and not through armed force. But I don't know if I've convinced you. You probably know this story, but in 1956, during the Hungarian uprising, the Hungarians expected the United States to come to their assistance. And in fact, they had every reason to believe that the United States would come to their assistance, because they'd basically been told that through Voice of America. What's that? And so did the Kurds, yeah. And when the uprising was going forward, they continued to put out radio broadcasts saying, we've started this uprising. We expect the United States to come in. And of course the United States didn't come in. And, it would have been naive for anyone outside of Hungary to imagine that the United States would have come to the defense of freedom fighters in Hungary. But of course, the Hungarians were living on hope, and they really, this was what they imagined the United States stood for. I used 1956 only because it was at the height of the Cold War, and it was at a time when, when you would have imagined the United States to have done precisely that. It was before Bay of Pigs. It was before, any of the other examples of U.S., shall we say, hypocrisy. But it didn't. So I don't think there should be any surprise for anyone in the world about what the calculations are of the United States. And if the United States was willing to basically sacrifice Hungary, a country of 10 million people, in order to preserve the stability of the Cold War in the face of the Soviet Union, well, of course, the United States is going to do something similar with respect to Ukraine in order to preserve stability. Stability is the most important consideration. It's not a question of American lives versus Ukrainian lives. It's a question of the larger stability of the geopolitical sphere. And that's not just a consideration that is utmost in the minds of the administration, i.e. the president. It's utmost in the minds of Pentagon. The Pentagon is always more concerned about stability and the preservation of its influence compared to the prospect of things going out of control and therefore the Pentagon not being able to predict what was going to happen. And that's exactly what they want to avoid. Because if escalation returns to the Donbas, it's not just fighting. It's not just a military conflict. It's unpredictability. Because the Pentagon won't know what's going to happen in that area. But the lower the risk, the better, as far as the Pentagon is concerned. Now, obviously, with respect to U.S. troops and the dispatch of U.S. troops, there has to be as little risk as possible. But even when the Pentagon is considering scenarios involving situations that won't involve U.S. troops. So, that agreements be damned, to be honest with you, from Washington's perspective. And here I'm giving you Washington's perspective. I'm not giving you my perspective or the perspective of the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm telling you what the inside the Beltway perspective is on geopolitics. And it has always been fundamentally a realpolitik perspective. Now, there have been exceptions, very brief exceptions. Jimmy Carter, for 2 years, in the first 2 years of his tenure as president, put human rights as a priority. That didn't last very long. It became institutionalized, but as a fundamental driver of U.S. policy, human rights no longer became, as important as it was for those 2 years. And there have been other examples in which, realpolitik was not the primary motivating factor behind U.S. policy. But, when it comes to Ukraine, realpolitik is king, because we're talking about two enormous entities, Russia and the EU, and the United States is desperate not to see any major unraveling of the EU or any major confrontation with Russia. That's the bottom line. Oh, I'm sure it sees it as a threat. It's a question of comparative threat. If we just look at Russia taking territory, the United States is not happy about that. Of course it's not happy about that. But then the United States looks at Georgia, looks at Moldova, says, well, we're not happy about those situations, but they have not proven to be major instigators of regional conflagration, shall we say. And effectively, the United States is looking at Donbas in a similar situation. I mean, it sees, I wrote a piece recently on frozen conflicts. And I compared frozen conflicts to what happens when someone goes into shock, essentially. If you have a stroke or a heart attack, one of the first medical responses is to lower the temperature of the body. And it's been discovered, not surprisingly, that bodies in trauma that have effectively died for as much as 12 hours, if the temperature of the body has been reduced considerably, it's possible to revive the body. So I made this comparison between frozen conflicts and frozen bodies, essentially. Reducing the temperature of a conflict, as in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Moldova, reducing that to effectively a frozen conflict makes it possible from the, shall we say, the U.S. point of view, for that conflict to be contained and for that body, the body of Georgia, the body of Moldova, to be revived at some point in the future. Probably it looks at Donbas in the same way, through a ceasefire, through some kind of political negotiations. The temperature of the conflict has been reduced. It's still a body in trauma, but the potential of saving Ukraine, of preserving its territorial integrity at some future date is enhanced in the same way that the body that has a stroke, can be revived at some point in the future. Every country ultimately comes up against this paradox of, we could call it the paradox of U.S. rhetoric versus U.S. action. We could talk about the quote-unquote burdens of responsibility of U.S. leadership in the world, that it has to make tough choices, and those tough choices are always going to be connected to U.S. national interests and not the national interests of other countries. However you want to frame it, every country has to come up against that. The only countries that are able to push back against that are countries that have a degree of geopolitical power that is at some level comparable to the United States. China, when it comes to its economic power, or, say Saudi Arabia, and I wouldn't say Saudi Arabia actually has that anymore, given that the U.S. has largely broken its dependency on Middle East oil. The EU collectively, not any particular EU country, but the EU collectively, and to a certain extent, at some point or another, Russia, all of these countries are able to assert their national interests against U.S. national interests and effectively negotiate some kind of compromise. All other countries, when they assert their national interests, are completely overwhelmed because they don't have anything remotely comparable to U.S. economic and geopolitical power, and therefore their national interests are always going to be trumped by U.S. national interests. And therein you get the paradox between U.S. actions and U.S. rhetoric. That's why I recommend, again, going all the way back to the beginning, that the best way that Ukraine can assert its national interests, including territorial integrity, is to have as strong a political order and economic order as possible. Because only then can it go into negotiations and have any chance of asserting itself on anything remotely close to an equal basis with its negotiating partners, including the United States. As long as the Ukraine is standing there with a tin cup, basically begging for assistance, it will be treated that way. And that, I'm not happy about that. I'm just telling you, I'm trying to tell it like it is, coming from Washington, giving you the Washington perspective, which is not my perspective. It just happens to be my reading of the prevailing sentiments inside the Beltway.